Peter Frankopan's The Silk Roads. Chapter 6. The Road of Slaves. The scale of the slave trade was huge. So many slaves were sold to the East that the Pope often tried to ban it. In 775 AD, Pope Hadrian I declared that selling Christians was a disgraceful act. God forbid that it continue, he added. However, few listened. The lure and temptation of the money on offer were just too hard to resist, and so cities like Dublin, Utrecht and Venice grew as centres from which many slaves were exported to Asia. Although Venetians were important human traffickers, by far the most effective at this business were the people of Scandinavia. They were also known as Vikings. We often think of the Vikings arriving in the longships off the coast of Britain and terrifying the local population before wreaking havoc. But in fact, the toughest, most determined and terrifying Vikings did not head west from Scandinavia. They headed east and south. Like men, they went a long way in the search for gold, reads one runestone found close to Stockholm. But they died in the south, in Sörkland, the land of the Saracens or of the Arabs. Vikings certainly looked threatening. According to one account, from the tips of his toes to his neck, each man is tattooed in dark green. Another noted that they were all like palm trees and dangerous. Each of them carries an axe, a sword, and a knife. They were famous for their stamina, their endurance, and their willingness to do anything to get what they wanted, and they were known in the East as the Russ. This was perhaps a reference to their red hair, but more likely to their skill with the oar when rowing. It is where the name Russia comes from. The Vikings, by the way, did not wear horned helmets, despite what a lot of people think. The Vikings were feared wherever they went. "Save us, O Lord," one 9th century prayer from France implores. "From the savage Norsemen who destroy our country, they take away our young virgin boys. We beg you to save us from this evil." The number of silver coins that has been found in recent decades in Scandinavia and along routes connecting with the heart of Asia show that the scale of the slave trade with the lands of Islam was huge. In modern terms, it was a multi-billion-dollar industry. Slaves were very desirable in the Muslim world, not only slaves from Europe, but from Africa and Asia too. Guidebooks helped the wealthy choose which slaves to buy at sales, with advice ranging from smoothness of skin to how to avoid hidden defects like bad breath, deafness, or a stutter. Their sale aided an expansion in the trade of goods moving to other regions. One traveller from Spain who journeyed to Mainz in what is now Western Germany in the 10th century was amazed to find spices that only grow in the Far East like pepper, ginger, cloves, nard and galingale. He was even more astonished to find that Arabic silver coins were being used as currency alongside coins minted in Central Asia. By around 950 AD, things were starting to change. Rivalries across the Muslim world sparked a period of violence that led to Mecca itself being attacked, while there was also sudden changes of leadership from Baghdad to North Africa. A series of harsh winters had such a terrible impact that some people were even forced to pick the grains of barley from the dung of horses and asses and eat them. In the midst of this, the Rus began to look elsewhere. Fortified trading stations along the great rivers used for long-distance travel, like the Volga, the Dnieper, and the Dniester, had already begun to grow into towns such as Novgorod, Chernigov, and Kiev. Bases like these enabled the Rus to gain more and more political power at the expense of the Khazars, who found themselves in direct competition with their ambitious rivals and were soon overwhelmed by them. The Rus were determined to find major new marketplaces to buy and sell goods. They turned their eyes to the capital of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Constantinople was not just the biggest Christian city in Europe, it was one of the biggest cities in the world. Their attention was not entirely welcome, not least since the Rus used their first visits to Constantinople to ravage the outskirts, setting fire to buildings and terrifying the inhabitants. Although this wasn't the best way to make friends, relations did eventually settle down. especially after Vladimir, the ruler of the Rus, converted to Christianity in 988 AD. The economy of the Rus began to change too, with its tough warrior society giving way to a culture more interested in good administration, trade in luxury objects, and borrowing ideas, culture, and even architecture from Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. The Rus were not the only ones in closer contact with magnificent Constantinople and the Christian East. Rising numbers came to settle in the imperial capital, such as merchants from Pisa, Genoa, and Venice, lured by the prospect of trade with Byzantium and the possibility of gaining access to goods from Asia. Others simply came looking for adventure, and some even joined the bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. One example was Harald Hardrada, the future king of Norway, who was later defeated by the Anglo-Saxon King Harold at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England in 1066. Some of the Anglo-Saxon nobles who took part in the Battle of Hastings that occurred just a few weeks later then fled when William the Conqueror took power in England. They headed for Constantinople in search of a new life. Europe was changing by this time. Castles and monasteries had started to spring up in order to cater for an aristocracy that was increasingly ambitious, curious, and pious. Interest in visiting the lands where Jesus Christ had lived, died, and risen from the dead grew sharply as more and more people began to take the long, difficult, and expensive route to visit Jerusalem and other holy sites. These pilgrims often journeyed in large groups and usually passed through Byzantine capital of Constantinople, where for centuries many Christian relics had been kept, such as the crown of thorns and parts of the sacred true cross on which Jesus Christ had been crucified. Then in 1095, something extraordinary happened. Upheaval in the Muslim world resulted in Turks not only taking control of Baghdad, but expanding westwards almost as far as the walls of Constantinople itself. For the Byzantine emperor Alexius Komnenos, it was the final straw. His empire was already on the ropes, with an economy in real trouble and under pressure from neighbours elsewhere too. He reached out to Pope Urban II for military help, hoping that large numbers of knights would journey to aid his recovery of some of the biggest cities in Asia Minor, an area covering most of what is now Turkey, that had recently been lost. The Pope leapt at the chance. He knew that the Christian empire in the East was in serious trouble and needed help. He also realized that a successful expedition could assist in mending fences within Europe itself, where there were serious divisions among the Christian faithful, which led to the Pope being challenged by kings and even by other senior priests. Uniting against an outside enemy could stop them arguing amongst themselves. Pope Urban begged, encouraged, and even bullied knights to set out on his campaign. The start of the famous Crusades. And Jerusalem was the prize. Not everyone was impressed. Roger of Sicily, who ruled over many Muslims as well as Christians and Jews, refused to go, and apparently raised his leg to let out a loud fart to show the Pope what he thought of the plans. But many did respond. Incredibly, against extraordinary odds and despite several close shaves with disaster, those who took part in the First Crusade successfully fought their way across thousands of miles and in the summer of 1099 reached the Holy City. The assault began on the 15th of July. Raimbold of Creton, a young knight from Chartres in France, was the first to reach the top of the city walls. Defenders were waiting for him, and in one clean blow chopped off his arm, but the attackers broke through and set about butchering the inhabitants. Jerusalem was soon filled with dead bodies piled up on mounds as big as houses outside the city gates, as one author put it. If you had been there, wrote another a few years later, your feet would have been stained to the ankles with the blood of the slain, and no one was left alive. Neither women nor children were spared. It was not just Muslims who were killed. Jews had been targeted by the Crusaders too as they crossed Europe, with Jewish communities subjected to appalling violence. Anyone and everyone in Jerusalem was a target. The Christian knights saw their success as a chance to avenge the killing of Jesus centuries before, as well as to get revenge for their friends who had not made it. The slaughter eventually came to an end as it began to dawn on the leaders that, although they had reached their goal, They now had to work out what would happen next. The Crusaders realized that holding on to their gains in the Holy Land would not be easy. The question was whether they would be able to do so, and whether it was worth it.